Today I want to take some time to talk irrigation and how I'm doing that. It's an interesting approach, and it's one that I've had to evolve upon, and one that I'm actually still trying to figure out, because I don't have one way that I can irrigate everything. Here's why. I have rows of tomatoes, and then interplanted between those rows, I have rows of cover crop, which could also be crops like radishes or lettuce or something else that I'll grow later on. But the tomatoes themselves are what causes a little bit of worry. I'm trying to keep the foliage on these guys as dry as possible, as much as I can. So just setting up turrets here, towers with overhead rotary sprinklers to irrigate all this isn't really an option for me because it'll get the tomatoes wet. So the question then becomes, how do you irrigate the cover crop without getting the tomato wet? Now, one option is drip line, but I'll tell you later why I don't want to use that on the cover crop. First though, let's start with the tomatoes themselves. How am I irrigating those? Well, the tomatoes themselves, I use my standard go-to irrigation line, and that is Netafim Techline. This is a 12 millimeter diameter Netafim line. This is just a sample of it, and it has built-in emitters. So they're impregnated in the drip tubing itself. There's all sorts of filters in here. They will not clog. They tend to never clog, and they're pressure compensating, meaning if you have a long run that's sloped like this, a lot of drip line that's not pressure compensated, or all drip line that's not pressure compensated, when you turn it off, gravity is just going to pull the water out, and it's all going to drain out the lower dripper. Well, these are pressure compensated, so when you turn the water off, if there's a slope, these low ones won't drip out. Now, within reason, that's true. If there's a big slope, they will drain out, but they are pressure compensated, which is a nice feature to have. Now, this is the 12 millimeter diameter Techline. They also sell a 17 millimeter Techline. When I first ordered this, I screwed up. I didn't realize what I was getting, and I thought I was ordering the 17, and I got the 12. So it showed up at my door, and I had none of the 12 style fittings for it, so it was useless until I was able to order more. In terms of fittings, how does it work? How do you deal with it? How do you connect these lines? It just uses standard barb type fittings which slide in, and they actually slide in relatively easy compared to other drip line that I've used. But just make sure you get the right size barb fittings based on the drip line that you're using. If you're going with Netafim, either the 12 or 17 millimeter, there are different size fittings. So the barb fittings, they tend to work pretty well. One thing I don't like when it comes to Netafim is they don't have like quick release couplers. So they don't have anything where you could put a barb in on one side and then have an actual threaded connection with a gasket between it so you could disconnect the line. That would be really useful if you're laying line down and then you want to churn over a bed, and you could just disconnect the line and then pull it up. When you have the barb fittings, they're not something you can pull in and out. Once they're in, they're in. You can get them out, but you have to cut the drip line. So that's one downside of using the Netafim that I don't like, is they don't have these quick coupler connections that you see on other drip lines. Why Netafim? Well, for me, why I like it is it's thick. This stuff is way thicker than normal drip tape. A lot of people don't like drip tape because it kinks, it twists, it clogs. You can get cuts in it from your harvest knives or from hose. This stuff is really thick. This is not going to get nicked and get a cut into it. So that's why I like it. I use this stuff all over the property. I use the 17 millimeter on the perimeters to water all the tree crops. I put it down, I put mulch over it. Eventually it gets buried and it just stays that way. It's really efficient in terms of how you irrigate. There's all sorts of spacings in terms of where the emitters are on the line, and there's all sorts of flow rates per emitter that you can get. So you can customize it to any setting. If you go to Netafim's site itself, they have a nice little chart based upon how much water you want to put down, what type of soil you have, what type of emitter spacing you have. You can customize essentially your drip line by buying the right product to those exact specs. The drip line that I have up here was a little tricky to get, or tricky to find in terms of what I was going to go with. Because you look at these charts and it has sandy soil, loamy soil, clayey soil, gravelly soil, and I'm trying to think, well, what type of soil is this? And I'm thinking, well, it's clay. But I'm trying to also think, what direction is this soil going? because this drip line is going to last years and years and years. This is not a one and done, chuck it type drip line. So it's going to last for years. So I tried to find a drip line that would be adequate for where I want the soil to be down the line, which is more of a loamy style. The problem though, when you get to loamy, is the shortest interval spacing they had on their drippers was 18 inches. That wasn't going to work for me. I wanted something closer, so I actually went with a tech line that is more for sandy soil. I'd rather put down more water faster and have closer spacing than go with wider spacings for a loamy soil. So the specs on the line that I use are 12-inch spacings. There's one impregnated emitter built into the line itself. It's inside the tubing itself. You can't feel anything on the outside. There's only one small hole where the emitter itself is. There's one of those every 12 inches. Each emitter puts out 0.6 gallons per hour. That translates into roughly 1 inch per hour. If you're trying to think about how much rain are my crops getting in terms of inches, well, you run this line, each emitter is putting out 1 inch per hour. So the flow rate, that's okay. 1 inch an hour, that's fine. It's much faster than other flow rates that they have on their other drip lines, which can go down to like 0.25 gallons per hour. So this puts out a lot of water pretty quickly, but they also have ones that put out a lot more water pretty quickly, putting out 1 gallon per hour. The 12-inch spacing was really what was critical here for me. I was figuring I'm going to use this potentially on row crops, on root veg, so I wanted spacing closer, not wider apart, just to help with germination. And for tomatoes, where my tomatoes are spaced at about 10 inches apart each or 12 inches apart each, with 12-inch spacings, I tend to get an emitter roughly on every tomato, which is what I want. My strategy for going down the tomato rows is simple. One line goes down like this, it wraps around to the other end just like this and comes back this way and ties into a main line. The nice thing about this Netafim is it has a 6-inch bending radius. You don't have to put a square end in here. You can bend it and it won't kink. I mean, on this piece, I had to go all the way into here before it eventually kinked. So it's nice to know that you can just curve it around, and that's what I do. So no cutting involved, you can preserve the length. In terms of length itself, on one of these runs, depending on the pressure that's coming into your line, you can run about 200 to 400 feet of drip line at a time before it starts to, the pressure can't feed all the emitters themselves. So that's more drip line than I need in the situation that I have. I've been pretty satisfied with this product overall. I really like it. It hasn't clogged, it hasn't cut, it hasn't tore, it doesn't break down in UV. We have the problem out here where a lot of coyotes or night critters will tend to chew drip lines and you'll find pinholes in them. Not so much a problem with this drip line because it's actually pretty thick drip line. And I haven't found too many bite holes in these compared to some of the cheaper stuff that was on the property when I first got here. But this will cost you around $100 for 500 feet of drip line. Not too bad, especially if you're looking at a permanent solution. Like I said, a lot of this stuff on my property is buried under mulch. I'll never pull it up. It's irrigating trees and it's a one and done. So for that price, to know that you're getting really high quality drip line that's not going to clog, that's not going to rip, that's not going to tear, it's UV protected, Netafim Tech line is the one that I like. So Netafim is what I use on the tomatoes right here. But what about those cover crops I showed you about? How am I going to water those? That's the interesting problem. Let's talk about that right now. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the problems I'm having is watering the tomatoes and watering the cover crop all using one system. I don't want to get the tomatoes wet, but I want the cover crop wet. I'm also trying to be water conscious out here. If I just put rotary sprinklers in here that irrigated this whole area, I'd be wetting the pathways. And I know that's going to help feed the plants, but I'm trying to keep water off the pathways as much as possible and put it into the plants as much as possible. So really, I'm not looking at one system to do this. I'm looking at two systems. The tomatoes are the Netafim drip line. The cover crop, or whatever else is going to go in these beds here that aren't tomatoes, and how are they going to get watered when the tomatoes aren't in? That's become an interesting problem. What I've tried to find are a bunch of drip lines or sprinklers that can just handle a small radius, and it's really, really hard to find those. But I think I finally have found some U-type down sprayers. They basically sit on a stake like this, and they're in the shape of a U or like a lowercase n, and they sit down on top of a stake like this, and they spin around like this, putting a cone of water down. And you can control the radius of that cone based upon what type of spinner you have. And the radiuses are really tight, going from like 18 to 36 inches. Found those at dripworks.com. I'm gonna order some of those and try them out. The frustration with those is gonna be they have about a 24-inch spray radius, which is fine on width because I have 24-inch beds, so that's perfect. I put a stake in the middle of each bed going down the row. That's fine. The whole bed width gets watered. Minimal goes onto the pathways. I don't get overspray going onto the tomatoes. That's all good. That's what I want. But the pain is, this is like a 40-foot row. I'm gonna have like 35 of these little things going all the way down the row, or 20 of these things going all the way down the row, some number of them going all down the row, which means every time I set up a bed like this, I'm gonna have to put in all these 20 stakes, and they're all gonna be connected to a main line which feeds them, which is a little bit of a nuisance, not just to set up, but to roll up at the end of the day and contain and keep it all orderly so I can actually use it again. That's the challenge I have, but that's the one I'm looking into. It's the best solution I've found so far to try and water these. You know, why don't I want to use drip line on here? It's cumbersome. Starting seeds with drip line, I've never had great luck with it unless you have a lot of drip line in that area, so you end up hand watering at the beginning anyway. And then maintaining the crop with drip line, that should work just fine. But then I get all the drip line at the base of the bed as this cover crop grows up through it. A lot of the cover crop that I'm growing is pea or vetch. It's viney, it's got tendrils, it forms this net. Trying to pull the drip line up through that cover crop rips up the crop itself, tears the crop. It's a pain in the butt. It's not something I really want to do if I don't have to. The other thing is the chickens are going to come in here at some point. And I don't want the irrigation on the ground when they do come in. So if I say I was to try and avoid the problem of ripping the drip line out and just leave it in there, well, when the chickens come in, they're walking all over the drip line, they're pecking at it, and while it's thick, it's just not something I want them to do. So I think going with a rotary sprinkler overhead with a very small spray diameter should hopefully work. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. I'm going to order a bunch. They're pretty cheap. It's about $1.50 per unit, so not the worst thing. That includes a little leader, the stand, and the sprayer itself. Not terrible. Fairly cheap in the grand scheme of things. But there'll be a bunch of them just going down the line like this that stand up with a little leader that comes off to a main line which runs right down the edge of the bed, and then I'll be able to turn each bed on, and they will only water the cover crop. I think part of the problem I've had in the past getting cover crop established is with good watering, keeping the soil moist enough. And one way I think I can make that better is by having an automated watering system to water the cover crop when I plant it. Right now I'm just hand watering the cover crop, and I only do that maybe once, sometimes twice a day. I don't think it's staying moist enough, so I'm not getting the germination rates as good as I want. If I have an automatic system on a timer, I could have it come on 3, 4, 5 times a day, even for little periods, to keep that soil continually moist. But one last problem that I'm also running into is when I germinate the cover crops, I put the row cover over this or shade cloth over this. So I'm trying to figure out how am I going to get the stake through the shade cloth, and what I might have to just give into is just piercing the shade cloth with the stake, and then coming back later when I remove the shade cloth, remove all the drippers, pull the shade cloth off, put all the drippers back, and I'm on my way again. A little more maintenance that I want to do. I don't really have a choice. Maybe there's better options out there. I couldn't really find them, but finding close diameter spray emitters is actually really hard. There's just not a lot of them out there. That's where I'm at with everything. This is how I irrigate. I'll give you more updates on this in the future, but we'll see. We'll see. It's all a challenge. It's all an experiment. Overall, though, the one thing that does work really well is this Netafim Tech line. If you want a link to that, check out the show notes below here. I'm continuing to experiment, see how it all goes. I'll give you updates on the irrigation itself and how I tie that actually into my main line, which was a challenge in and of itself, given that this is 12 millimeter, not 17 millimeter. Never easy, always challenges, but all ones that can be overcome. So thanks for watching this one. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.